author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the face of an unidentified threat, the administration has decided to opt for the Winnie the Pooh defense and bury its head in the honey jar. Now, what does this mean for dealing with aerial incursions? What's happening with inflation? And what is the state of the Second Amendment in light of the new ATF ruling? All this and more on today's show. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we talk spy balloons, Bidenomics, and guns. What a combination. I'd like to take a special moment to say thank you to our listeners on KXYL 1240 AM and 102.3 FM out in Brownswood, Texas. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. With unidentified objects floating across the continental United States and fighter jets scrambling to take them down, there's a lot of unanswered questions and more than a little deflection. Well, to help us navigate precisely what is happening and also what is not, we're joined by Liberty Nation author and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Mr. Dave Patterson. Welcome back to the show, Dave. Good to have you on.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, you've been providing what I'd class as rolling coverage for the pages of Liberty Nation on these flying or floating objects. And to me, it seems you've provided some of the most comprehensive analysis that's available on the net. So what's your take, as of recording time, these four objects that have so far been encountered?
Well, I think you can look at this in a kind of in sequence. So when did we know about the balloon? 200 feet high, roughly 14 stories, not hard to miss. And two fellows in Montana didn't miss it, whereas the entire United States government did. So we first learned that it came into the airspace on the 28th of January. And it was 4 days later that President Biden was briefed on it on the 1st of February. And then they dithered, and it went over many of our sensitive military installations, like Malmstrom Air Force Base with the ICBM fields.
That's the Montana one, right? That's in Montana.
That's right, in Montana. And then you had also Malmstrom Air Force Base is one of the key communications nodes for our Global Strike Command and Control. And then it meandered down and looked at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, where we have B-2s, our global strike capability. And finally, 4 days or later, the president decided to shoot it down over, as it coasted out over South Carolina. So we had quite a long time in which this balloon was or should have been known to us. Now, lo these many days later, we have the intelligence community that tells us, we knew about this balloon when it took off from Hainan Island in China, and we have been tracking it ever since it took off. Oh, that's good to know. That's really good to know. Had we known about this a little earlier, it might have been more easily dealt with. And
sorry to interrupt, Dave. Strategically, if they knew about it when it came from Hainan Island, which, by the way, is the go-to holiday destination for Chinese and expats in China, it's a very, very fancy place. Surely there's a big stretch of ocean in which it could have safely been shot down when it was apparent that it was approaching land, rather than waiting until it coasted off the other side at South Carolina, no?
Well, I think more importantly, there was plenty of open space over which you could have brought this balloon down safely. And I mean, I guess we're, geography challenged in our government that they wouldn't know this. But the fact is that what's kind of disturbing is now we have a rather prominent Washington newspaper that is telling the story of how we knew this was a balloon from Hainan when it took off. And basically they're flacking for global news, the the Communist Chinese or the Chinese Communist Party news outlet, which is what they said. And, it's just a new balloon. It got off track. It got into the jet stream. We couldn't control it. Well, okay. But we've kind of dismissed that as a logical explanation.
Okay, and then there were three others, which I haven't seen too many reports describing what they are, but I believe one description is a hexagonal metallic balloon with strings dangling off it. What is that?
Well, right now we're trying to determine that. What it looks to me like is that it could easily be some sort of a reconnaissance balloon, but now we're thinking it's more likely, and this is somewhat comical, that it's a balloon. This is what they've said. It's a balloon that probably came from a used car dealership that was advertising, sales. But there's kind of a problem with that line of thinking, in that how many used car dealerships do you find in northern Alaska and in the Yukon?
And of course, those used car balloon men and things, they're generated by air. They're not helium-based products. They're generated by air. So once it comes out from the exhaust, once it comes out of the plug socket,
well, in all fairness, there are some large helium balloons, but very few used car dealerships in northern Alaska and the Yukon. But be that as it may, there are lots of things that are questionable and that just don't make any sense from the Biden administration, which is unfortunate, because we're dealing with two things that I think are very, very important. One is, can we detect balloons that might be a danger to us? And secondly, what is the decision time that this administration has demonstrated? First, and let me not just ramble on, but ramble on just enough. We saw in a number of photographs where the Chinese have demonstrated a large balloon with a gondola underneath it that carries hypersonic weapons. So if you don't have a decision process that finds these things very quickly, I mean, a hypersonic weapon over the United States gives you very, very little reaction time. And so these are the kinds of things that I think Americans should be, and the rest of the free world should be concerned about, is when you see something, how long does it take you to make a decision? And in these cases, it's been glacial, not to keep up with the metaphor of the northern tier bases.
Yeah, it seems almost excruciating how long the process takes. Now, China recently made an announcement saying that this sending of balloons, although they haven't claimed ownership of the latest three objects, that it's essentially a quid pro quo situation with the US engaged in similar tactics. Now, is this correct? Don't we know? Is it deflection?
It's deflection. We don't have, as best anybody knows, sure. And of course the president would be the last to know, whether we don't have balloon programs that are have reconnaissance capability. Now, having said that, we do have programs like the J-lens balloon that we use for border control, for looking for drug runners. We have used those kinds of balloons in the past, but they're tethered. They don't go anywhere. And so it's not likely that one of those came loose. And we simply don't have that program, and it's deflection.
Okay, and we're talking with Dave Patterson on the national balloon issue. We'll be back with Dave speaking about the unspoken security concerns facing the country after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're back with Dave Patterson, the fount of knowledge on all things Foggy Bottom. Earlier in the show, we discussed the unknown objects visiting American airspace. But now, I want to go a little darker and talk about the unknown unknowns, if you will. Now, Dave, you wrote a piece on LibertyNation.com that chilled just about everyone who read it. You noted how a small balloon or a similar device to the ones that we've been encountering could just as easily be carrying a small nuclear device or a hypersonic weapon that you mentioned in our last segment. Can you fill us in a little on this, please?
Yes, I think that this is something that the United States needs to be extremely concerned about. And again, it goes back to detection. These balloons have been shown to carry fairly significant payloads. And we talked about the possibility, and the Chinese have demonstrated at least that it can carry a gondola with hypersonic weapons pointed down, but it can also carry other things that are of concern. In one of the articles, as you mentioned, small nuclear devices, and they don't have to be very big to generate a fairly dangerous electromagnetic pulse. That would take out communications, would take out anything electrical, particularly the grids, which have circuitry boards. So anything that has, transistors, modern circuitry boards, is in jeopardy of being affected by EMP.
I think everyone wants to know why the authorities aren't spotting these things as soon as they should be. I mean, I read that the US radar system had to be recalibrated in order to detect what was coming in, specifically these balloon type objects. But does this mean that the radar system is only set up to look for one type of object at a time? And if we're busy looking for balloons, could we be missing something more threatening? I mean, it reminds me of the SETI system, which is the satellite array used to obviously detect alien life, or signals from obviously outer space. And the problem is there's all these huge satellites, but because the sky is so vast, they can only really use everything to look at about 1% of the available array. Now, is that a similar situation to the US radar system?
Well, it's analogous, but I think it's not necessarily similar. What I think we're faced with is that we have a number of systems. We have ground-based missile systems. We have what used to be called Strategic Defense Initiative and anti-missile systems, and they use very different kinds of radar. They're looking for high altitude, very fast objects. And then you have the systems that used to be the DEW line. It's now called Northern or North Warning System, that looks for aircraft and missiles, and that's a very different kind of targeting that the system and the frequency of the radars have to deal with. And one would think that, well, balloons moving slower would be easier to look at, but that doesn't appear to be the case.
So it seems to me, Dave, that the folks in defense and at the Pentagon, that they're perhaps a little too targeted in their thinking, as you say, they've either been looking for very fast-moving missiles or fairly fast-moving planes, aerial vehicles, and so they've got this one type of threat in mind. And is that limiting their ability to contemplate, let's call it a more unique form of potential warfare?
I think what it's doing is it's focusing their attention on one specific kind of threat while leaving the rest somewhat unattended. And so what we need is a broader look at all kinds of objects that might be coming our way, and having a decision time that reflects a quick reaction, whereas we've seen that's not been the case lately. And I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to start to look at. But much of the problem for the Biden administration is of their own making. And as I recall, in when things like this happened in the administrations that I was involved with, we immediately got out video. We immediately had our military experts brief every aspect of these kinds of events, and that's simply not happening. I mean, the Biden administration could have saved themselves a great deal of grief if they had known about these, and that was true, to get out right away and have one of the experts from NORAD track and explain with video. And every one of these fighters that destroyed these objects and the balloon all have weapons system video. They have to.
Yeah. And so that's not being provided. We assume it exists, but it's not being provided. So essentially, it's not letting any light on the situation, letting speculation run rampant. Now, Dave, I do have another question for you regarding this timeline that you were just talking about, from the decision to when a thing is detected to the president making the decision. It seems that in case of the Donald Trump administration, that timeline is roughly 3.5 years. How does that work?
Well, that's where the Biden administration loses all credibility. I mean, it wasn't until this balloon came up that they had but it happened to the Trump administration too. And the way we know this is because we traced back all of this information that we had that we never bothered to tell anyone. And
not even the president, apparently.
Not even the president, which is troubling in itself. I mean, you have these kind of faceless technicians that choose who they'll tell things of great strategic value in the United States, who they'll tell. And so literally all of the decision makers in the Trump national security team were not aware or never told, because all of them say precisely the same thing. And of course, a lot of them, as you know, have subsequently become detractors of Trump. So they're not, compelled to say nice things or things that support the former president.
Yeah, it seems to me that we have the Joe Biden situation with 4 days plus to make a decision. Why do you think the people who informed the chain of command decided that Joe Biden, who, let's be fair, has never come across as one of the more competent people in government, should be informed and Donald Trump should not?
Well, it's hard to get inside the heads of these folks. I mean, you have to continually remind yourself that all geopolitical and global crises situations have to be seen through the lens of the crackerjack response to the Afghan withdrawal.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is the same group of people, the same mindset that dealt with that so swimmingly. And so it's difficult to get inside their heads because a lot of things they do or say just don't make any sense.
It's living in the realms of political spin. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
Later in the show, we discuss the recent ATF decision on pistol braces. But up next, after this short break, we're back with Andrew Moran talking the political bonfire of the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Once again, it looks like President Joe Biden is ready to sell the family silver, at least in the petroleum form. Also, CPI numbers are out and the latest retail figures are something quite not to be believed. To discuss all of these topics and more, we're joined by Liberty Nation's resident economics expert, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, clearly, President Biden has jettisoned the term strategic from this and decided to rename it all piggy bank.
Yeah, so President Biden and his administration, they recently announced, even though the whole thing was just supposed to be 6 months, he announced that he's going to sell 26 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. That's the nation's emergency stockpiles that was meant for emergencies, not to support his agenda.
All right, and so this should be around how many barrels of oil at the congressionally approved limit is, I believe that's about 650 million barrels.
Right, in the strategic petroleum reserves, when he took office, it was around 600 million barrels, and now, ever since he started selling off, as you said, the piggy bank, it's right now it's sitting around 370 million. So do the math; he's been wiping out about 40% of the emergency stockpiles. Now, his administration said that they would start buying oil at around $70 a barrel. Now, the problem is that it's going to be challenging to get oil prices down to that level, considering the myriad of factors that are suggesting that it's very sensitive right now. So Russia recently announced that it's slashing about 500,000 barrels from its production. OPEC and OPEC Plus, they're reducing another about 2 million barrels. And if there's a recession going on and demand erases, then I'm sure more countries will also slash output. So overall, this whole idea of injecting oil into the markets, as you said, it's not very strategic considering what's going on in the broader petroleum markets.
And it seems to me, I'm not an expert in this field, but it seems to me that he's selling it at a price that's really not doing very much for the consumer at the pump. But at the same time, they're going to be spending tax dollars, which will inevitably lead to more taxation, or at least reappropriating tax dollars to try and rebuild this when the oil is going to be, as you say, at an unstable or higher price.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is on two fronts. So the first one is that the White House, I think I mentioned on your program a few weeks ago, the White House came out with a fact sheet that said removing barrels of oil from the strategic petroleum reserves has reduced the price of gasoline by 40 cents. So that's not a lot of savings for the consumer. And the second part is that if you look at the recent CPI numbers, the price of gasoline has gone up 2.4% month over month. So overall, a lot of these maneuvers haven't really done a lot to help consumers at the pump, especially if you're in places like California or the West Coast.
Well, let's talk about those CPI numbers you mentioned, because just this last week, the latest report came out. What were some of the big headline numbers for you?
Okay, so the two main numbers was that the annual inflation rate only eased to 6.4%, down from 6.5%, and the market anticipated a 6.2 reading. The second one was eye-popping, was that the month-over-month increase was 0.5%, up from 0.1% the previous month. Those are disappointing numbers, because this whole narrative in recent months has been that the U.S. is going through a disinflation process. And then if you could dive deeper into the CPI, as I said before, you're seeing a lot of steady increases, a lot of things that were coming down. So, for example, gasoline, as I said, was up 2.4% month over month. Beef and veal, which has come down considerably, actually rose 2.2%, which I mentioned in a recent C5, talking about that's going to be one of the major factors moving forward in food inflation will be beef and veal because of supply issues. So overall, a lot of things that are steadily going up again. And the issue is that the service sector inflation has been weighing considerably on inflation, because that actually rose 7.6%, higher than the overall 6.4% number.
So let's pass these numbers a little bit. So we hear 6.4, and yes, it's down 0.1 from the 6.5, but that's still above what the market's anticipated, which it creates let's call it at least mild market issues. But it seems to me that some numbers are down, but the numbers that are up are all the important ones. And we're talking food, energy, and shelter. What are those numbers specifically?
Yeah, so the supermarket prices, or the food at home category, that was up more than 11%. Within that category, you're seeing like eggs up 70% year over year from the previous month, lettuce up 20%, bread up 15%, coffee 9%. All these important food items have risen exponentially. On the energy front, as I said, gasoline was up, but also if you look at electricity costs, electricity costs up 7%, utility costs up 7%, also 7%. So a lot of things that people rely on is rising considerably. My concern is that I mentioned this in my recent article about inflation, is that you could see a similar environment as you did in the late 80s, early 1990s. So when Paul Volcker was head of the Federal Reserve, he saw that inflation peaked at 13%. So he started cutting the federal funds rate, or the benchmark interest rate. But then after inflation started coming down gradually, it started increasing again, which resulted in, again, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. So perhaps you could see a similar environment of perhaps not the recession, or excuse me, perhaps not a serious financial crisis, but a recession on top of, peaks and valleys of inflation.
I'm sure our listeners know this, but it reminds me of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it seems that the things that are most impacted are all above that 6.4% number. And I think that should really be what we look at as a world when we're considering how inflation impacts the average person. Now, we also had this week, Andrew, the retail numbers. Now, I am not familiar with these at the time of recording, but you seem quite animated about them. Care to fill us in?
Yeah, I woke up this morning, I saw 3%. I went, "Oh my god, retail sales!" But yeah, so the
he does that every
data,
day, listeners, by the way, regardless. But yeah, specifically, why this time, Andrew?
Well, so the latest retail sales data actually came in at 3%, up from negative 1.1% in the previous month. A lot of economists had expected 1.8%. Now, this was considerable, considering how you had, because for the last few months, retail sales have either fallen or just risen steadily. Now,
Sorry, Andrew, just to interrupt you quickly, what does this figure actually represent?
Retail trade, consumers buying at department stores, gasoline stations, apparel stores, things like that. But I tend to believe that this was just a one-off, because after the Christmas season, you have all the liquidation going on. And if you look at the retail sales data from the Census Bureau, most of the retail sales that occurred or heavily occurred was in department stores, because that figure was actually up 20% within the CB report. So I think that's just a one-off. Perhaps it's going to normalize in the coming months, or perhaps once again go in the downward trend. But that liquidation, I mean, that really contributed to the higher retail sales. And also, if you look at the other metrics, which perhaps supports my supposition, if you look at retail sales ex auto or ex gasoline, that actually only rose about a little more than 2%.
Okay, so it was the January sales to blame, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think that also this was an important metric, because perhaps it would lend credence to the idea that the U.S. is going to avoid a recession, or perhaps it lends support to the idea that the U.S. is going to go through a rolling recession. So yeah, I think this was quite an important retail sales report.
And one final question for you, Andrew. What's happening for mortgages at the moment? Are we approaching another big short or something else?
Well, it's the U.S. real estate market has been interesting, because it seems to have bottomed in December. You're seeing a lot of new home sales, pending home sales actually increase in a recent week, suggesting that the market's rebounding. But then a recent report came out from the Mortgage Bankers Association and actually showed that mortgage applications fell more than 7% in the week ending February 8th, I believe. And actually, the 30-year mortgage rate went up to nearly 6.4%. So this U.S. housing market, it's still technically in a recession because of all of the abysmal data over the last 12 months. But this is good. This is really interesting to watch if it's rebounding or if it's still in recession mode.
So we're back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs again: shelter, food, energy. It's all up in the air under Bidenomics. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back after this short break, discussing how the recent ATF decision impacts lawmaking in America. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With a mass of happenings through the courts of America and a new contentious effort from the ATF to impose regulations on law-abiding gun owners, it's high time to re-examine the state of the Second Amendment in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on Bruin versus National Rifle and Pistol Association. And who better to guide us through that than Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and man about town, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Scott, I think our audience is fairly familiar with what's been happening at the ATF. But if you could give us a brief review and then tell us the latest happenings, because you're writing an article at the moment which implies that ATF officials may have to cancel their vacation.
Yes, well, Joe Biden's ATF, and it is important, I think, to kind of bring it home to the administration. It's not like this is some government functionaries, doing what they want on their own. This is an administration effort to frustrate gun ownership and transfer and purchase. They basically created a rule that said that anybody who had a certain type of firearm accessory had to register that like it was a machine gun, which means a hyper-regulatory environment for this item rather than the kind of normal regulatory environment that any handgun may undergo. The Congressional Research Service says this will affect between 10 and 40 million of these devices in public hands.
So presumably
currently.
between 10 and 40 million individuals, Americans.
Well, you got to have a couple double purchasers within that
Sure.
within that mix, but most people probably don't have 3 of these things. And they have until the end of May to comply with this regulatory regime or suffer the consequences, which are becoming a federal felon. And we now have a host of groups that are suing the ATF in various jurisdictions to reverse this rule.
So let's talk about a few of these groups. I think probably the most notable one is a group of 25 attorneys general, and I hope I got the S on the correct word in that.
The plural possessive, always a favorite.
Okay, so what's their argument here that they're applying to the courts for?
Well, that suit that you're referring to was filed in, I believe, North Dakota federal court. And so some of this, the kind of deeper discussion about this is where they filed, because that may have the reason why we discuss that is because the chances of success may be greater. In all the cases that we're discussing, they're Republican appointed judges. And I think it was a Trump appointee who's in that North Dakota case. And that suit was filed by SB Tactical, I believe, which is a pistol brace manufacturer. And it was joined by almost all the Republican attorneys general states. So I think it's 25. Texas, by the way, we'll discuss that in a second. They went with a different suit. And that case is also now being funded by the NRA. So that's the NRA and all the Republican attorneys general. And the arguments in their case are, and in many of these, probably, well, it's fair to say all the cases, there are 2 main arguments. One is that the ATF is engaged in impermissible lawmaking with their proposed rule. And the other is, of course, that it violates the Second Amendment, especially in light of the recent Bruin decision from the Supreme Court.
Let's dig a little bit into this, Scott. You say that essentially the ATF is creating law from whole cloth, really, because
so
how does that work? We kind of assume that when a federal agency sets a rule, then there would need to be some kind of congressional agreement with that to make it a law, right? But what they're doing here is, I guess it's what a lot of people accuse judges of doing, legislating from the bench.
And this is legislating from the federal, basically the federal bureaucracy. Excuse me. This happens quite a bit. It's oftentimes not discussed or revealed because it's not in terribly contentious areas. But in minor areas, it happens all the time. And what happens is, the Congress says the federal government is to regulate, for instance, long arms, rifles, and shotguns differently than handguns. Well, what makes those things a handgun or a shotgun or a rifle? We may all have our understanding about what those things are, but articulating them into laws that are then going to be used to prosecute people for violating them, they're going to be challenged, and they have to be carefully constructed, as you might imagine. So that's what this whole controversy entails. For people who aren't in the gun culture, this is a firearm accessory that allows people to basically create a shorter package of a firearm that fires a cartridge that is typically associated with a rifle caliber, 223 or well, that's the most popular one. That's the native caliber for the AR-15. And so it became a wildly popular accessory, and it's sort of, the latest and greatest of any kind of phrase, or sweeping kind of trend. And that's what's happened with this. This has only been around for like 10 years. And Mark, what happened was the people who manufactured this brace sent letters to the ATF and said, is it okay to make this? Does it constitute basically a short-barreled rifle? And the ATF said no. And they're the only ones who can say, because they're the ones who determine under the rulemaking authority what it means to be a rifle or a handgun. So Congress needs to get in there and really I see you want to come in. I'm sorry.
I do. So
I go up my rambling on too long.
no, that's great. That's great information. So what I want to kind of get a grip on here is, you mentioned that it's coming in South Dakota. It's been filed, and that's specifically
That's
because
the NRA suit.
that's the
Yeah.
NRA suit, because there's a higher likelihood of success. Now, what does a success look like in this case? Is it the ATF has to repeal the new ruling that would, I don't know if this is a real word, felonize between 10 and 40 million Americans? Would they have to repeal that, or would
what success would look like is that a federal judge, or in that instance, I think it might be a magistrate judge who the case is currently assigned to, in any case, that they issue a stay, that they say this ruling is likely to be overturned at a trial, and so therefore we're going to implement a bar that prohibits the government from implementing this rule, full stop. And then people who own these devices don't have to worry about anything in the intermediate time. And then there'll be a more lengthy case that's presented in court with witnesses, a real trial over the issue, and then a ruling that indeed they were right, meaning the court that granted the stay in the first place was right, that this does violate either the ATF's authority or the Second Amendment or both. And then that decision from the district court is affirmed at the circuit court level. That would be really the complete. And if you want to go one step further, that they appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court either declines to take the appeal or takes it and then affirms it. That's what victory looks like, whether that's for the NRA case, whether that's for the ATF case, whether that's for the Gun Owners of America case, or that's for the Second Amendment Foundation cases, which are the three big ones on the board currently. And there's more, I'm sure, that I don't know of, and probably some more that will be filed between now and May 31st.
Now, again, Scott, we often end up coming back to this because it seems that law in America, and that's really what our Talking Liberty segments are often about, law to really have a clear and bright line ruling, as you may or may not get from the Supreme Court. It seems to me that this is a question beyond the scope of pistol braces, the ATF. It's who has the authority to make something a crime in the United States. Now,
yes,
we say that this is obviously appears to be taking place with the ATF, but the EPA has also being involved in this as well. And it seems to me that there isn't, or maybe there is, some kind of bright line ruling at the very highest court or courts in the land that says no federal agency, anything outside of Congress, has the ability to felonize or even misdemeanor somebody.
What you're discussing is called the delegation doctrine, right? And can Congress delegate its lawmaking authority to federal agencies? And there's a great tension in there. Typically, conservatives and libertarians are saying absolutely not. It's not okay for them. There's a very good reason why Congress has lawmaking authority and the executive does not, and that the courts do not. Now, typically on the Democrat and the lefty side of things, they are much more interested in lawmaking through the federal agencies. It gives them, they're I mean, let's be honest, they're relatively speaking, they're captured by the left, these large agencies, right? And so if they have lawmaking authority, then they can do through agency action what they could never do, through the political process of legislating in the Congress.
Okay, Scott DiCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Dave Patterson, Andrew Moran, and Scott DiCosenza. And of course, my appreciation to you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in. And my final thought for this week, I just want to take a moment to consider something. A government that refuses to act. It refuses to keep its citizens informed of unidentified threats. And one that, parallel with this, is overseeing the financial destruction of the middle class. Now, what kind of government is that? And perhaps a more important question might be, in whose interest is such a government operating? Something to ponder there, I think. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5 produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone, hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner, joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing leftist narratives, debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.